Throughout human history, one story rises again and again, echoing across continents and cultures. The tale of a flood so vast it nearly ended the world. In Mesopotamia, scribes pressed it into clay tablets as the Epic of Gilgamesh. In India, storytellers preserved it in the ancient texts of Manu. The Hebrew Bible recounts Noah's Ark, while indigenous peoples from the Americas to the Pacific Islands describe a deluge that wiped out earlier generations. The persistence of this story suggests more than coincidence. It hints at a memory so powerful that it survived in myth and scripture, reshaped but never erased. Mainstream scholars view this repetition through the lens of geology and anthropology. At the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago, melting glaciers raised sea levels worldwide. Low-lying settlements vanished beneath the waves, while sudden floods carved valleys and transformed rivers. Communities living in fragile landscapes would have experienced catastrophic change, and their descendants preserved the trauma in oral tradition. From this perspective, the Great Flood is not a single event but a collective memory of rising waters, transmitted through metaphor and divine imagery. Yet alongside the mainstream explanation lies an enduring mystery. Why do cultures separated by oceans, with no apparent contact, tell stories so similar not only in theme but in detail? Survivors saved on boats, mountains emerging from receding waters, and gods or sky beings warning select humans of the coming disaster. Some researchers suggest this cannot be reduced to coincidence or allegory. They argue that these myths may point to a real singular catastrophe, one that left such a scar on humanity that it became the foundation of early civilizations' memory. Alternative thinkers expand this idea further. They speculate that the flood did more than erase coastlines. It may have buried entire civilizations, wiping away evidence of cultures advanced for their time. Others suggest that non-human beings, giants, hybrids, or even visitors from beyond the Earth, vanished with the waters, leaving only traces in the form of strange artifacts and anomalous bones. This perspective does not deny natural causes like rising seas, but it introduces the possibility that humanity once shared the planet with others, whose existence is obscured beneath the flood's veil. Whether symbolic, historical, or cosmic, the flood remains the greatest unsolved riddle in our collective past. Thus, the story of the Great Flood forms a crossroads. On one path lies the consensus of science, natural climate change shaping myth. On the other path lies speculation, that ancient wisdom, advanced civilizations, or other species were swept away. The truth may lie somewhere in between. What is certain is that the flood endures, not just as a tale of destruction, but as a question. What exactly was lost when the waters rose, and why do so many still believe something remains hidden beneath them? To understand the Great Flood, we must first look to the end of the last ice age, a period of staggering transformation in the Earth's climate and landscapes. Roughly 20,000 years ago, glaciers stretched across much of North America, Europe, and Asia, locking away enormous volumes of water. These ice sheets were miles thick, reshaping valleys and crushing mountains under their weight. But around 12,000 years ago, temperatures began to rise, and with them came a relentless melt. Rivers swelled, seas crept higher, and coastlines shifted in ways that would have been devastating for the small, scattered human populations of the time. Mainstream geologists explain that as glaciers retreated, massive floods occurred repeatedly across the globe. In North America, for example, the great ice-dammed lakes burst open, unleashing torrents that carved out entire regions, leaving behind features such as the channeled scablands of Washington state. Similar processes were at work in Eurasia, where meltwater reconfigured rivers like the Danube and reshaped fertile basins. The cumulative effect of these events was profound. Within just a few millennia, global sea levels rose more than 120 meters. For communities living near rivers, lakes, or coastal plains, this was nothing short of apocalyptic. Evidence of these cataclysmic events is found not just in myths, but in stone and soil. Geological strata preserve layers of flood deposits, while submerged landscapes off modern coastlines tell of once thriving ecosystems. In the North Sea, an area known as Doggerland once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Archaeologists have discovered tools, animal bones, and even traces of human settlement there, now buried beneath waves. This land, fertile and rich with game, was home to people who had to abandon it as waters consumed their world. Perhaps the most striking example of sudden flooding is found in North America with the story of Lake Missoula. This massive glacial lake, trapped by ice in what is now Montana, repeatedly burst through its barriers during warming periods. When it did, walls of water hundreds of feet high thundered across the land, scouring valleys and leaving behind landscapes that look alien even today. The scablands of Washington bear the scars. Channels, dry falls, and erratic boulders carried hundreds of miles. Geologists see in these events the power of nature alone. To them, the repeated cycle of ice damming and collapse explains the massive scale of the destruction, without invoking lost civilizations or supernatural causes. But alternative thinkers suggest that the extraordinary violence of these floods, occurring at the precise end of the Ice Age, may have been triggered by more than just warming air. Some hypothesize that cosmic events, like comet impacts or solar disruptions, accelerated melting or destabilized ice sheets. While such claims remain speculative, they remind us that Earth's climate is tied to the wider universe, and catastrophic change may come suddenly, not gradually. Outside of North America, the Black Sea holds another potential clue. Geological studies suggest that around 5600 BCE, the rising Mediterranean Sea breached the Bosporus Strait, flooding the Black Sea basin in a catastrophic event. This flood may have submerged entire Neolithic communities, transforming a freshwater lake into the saltwater sea we know today. Artifacts recovered from the seafloor hint at earlier human presence, and sonar mapping has revealed structures that could represent settlements now lost to history. Mainstream interpretations frame this event as regional, not global, a natural result of glacial melt and ocean expansion. Yet, the scale of destruction for the people living there would have been immense, displacing tens of thousands and rewriting the landscape of southeastern Europe. Some scholars even connect this event to the biblical flood story, arguing that it was remembered and reshaped by migrating peoples. Alternative theories extend further, suggesting that such abrupt flooding wiped out entire chapters of human development, erasing cultures advanced for their time. If so, the Black Sea flood may represent not only geological upheaval, but cultural amnesia. One more missing piece in humanity's larger puzzle of forgotten origins. Rising seas also transformed Asia. In Southeast Asia, large areas that once formed a continent-like shelf, known today as Sundaland, were gradually submerged. This drowned landscape connected modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and parts of the Philippines, creating fertile lowlands where ancient people thrived. As seas rose, entire river systems and coastlines disappeared. Myths from the region, preserved in Austronesian traditions, speak of lands swallowed by the ocean, with survivors forced to seek higher ground or scatter to distant islands. Mainstream archaeology sees this as another example of climate migration shaping cultural memory. But some alternative researchers highlight how many myths from this region emphasize sudden destruction, fire and water combined, or beings that guided people to safety. They suggest this may point to more than natural flooding, perhaps catastrophic events, or the intervention of beings remembered later as gods or sky visitors. While mainstream evidence does not confirm these interpretations, the striking overlap between submerged landscapes and enduring myth keeps speculation alive. Sundaland remains an underwater frontier, its secrets preserved beneath layers of silt, waiting for exploration that may either confirm the ordinary or reveal the extraordinary. In the Americas, too, flood legends abound. Indigenous nations recount ancestral stories of rising waters that forced migrations to higher lands. Archaeologists studying Paleo-Indian sites find evidence of shifting patterns in settlement and hunting coinciding with the end of the Ice Age. For example, mammoth hunters in the Great Plains adapted as the megafauna vanished, possibly tied to climate upheaval. Coastal groups dependent on fisheries saw their shorelines swallowed by encroaching seas. Mainstream anthropology links these changes to the natural rhythm of warming and sea level rise. Yet alternative interpretations again enter. Some researchers point to myths of giants swept away by floods, or tales of star people departing during cataclysm. These stories, they argue, may encode memories of encounters with other beings, whether distinct hominid species or visitors beyond our understanding. Skeptics caution that such claims rest on fragile ground, often extrapolating myth into history without hard evidence. But the persistence of such accounts across distant cultures continues to fuel curiosity. If nothing else, it illustrates how human imagination, when faced with catastrophe, stretches to explain what science struggles to illuminate fully. Taken together, The end of the Ice Age presents us with a picture of immense upheaval. Glaciers retreated, seas surged, and human communities were reshaped forever. Mainstream evidence points to climate change, natural flooding, and the resulting migrations as the foundation of global flood myths. But the scale of the destruction leaves room for enduring questions. Could whole civilizations have been erased, leaving behind only fragments of stone beneath the waves? Did sudden cosmic events accelerate the destruction beyond what geology alone can explain? And what of the stories? Of giants? Of gods? Of beings who warned or vanished? Are they merely symbolic, or hints at encounters we have yet to understand? As we leave the scientific explanations and step toward the realm of speculation, the mystery deepens. The flood myths might indeed stem from collective trauma, but trauma often distorts, reshapes, and magnifies reality. Somewhere in that distortion may lie a clue, a shard of memory, that points not just to water, but to something greater, something humanity sensed it had lost. The Ice Age ended with water, but perhaps also with the closing of a chapter we can no longer read. The close of the Ice Age thus frames our exploration. Mainstream science offers a compelling narrative of natural catastrophe, well supported by evidence. Yet alternative views linger, pointing to sudden disruptions, lost worlds, or even other species erased in the deluge. Both paths intersect in the same truth. The flood was real to those who lived through it. Their voices echo in myth, their ruins rest beneath oceans, and their memory survives in us. The Ice Age's end was not simply a geological event, it was a human event, shaping our story and perhaps hiding chapters still unrevealed. Mainstream science interprets this as a clear case of environmental migration. Communities were forced inland, carrying their survival stories, which later became myths of divine punishment or global catastrophe. Yet some researchers argue the timing and scale of these floods suggest something more sudden and devastating than gradual sea level rise. They point to meltwater pulses, brief periods when oceans surged dramatically in just decades, as possible culprits. For those living at the time, such events would not have felt like natural change but like the wrath of gods. And so, memory of these floods may have fused with spiritual belief, passing into the epic tales we still hear today. When we look for the earliest written record of the Great Flood, we arrive in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Around 2000 BCE, scribes in the ancient city of Nineveh pressed wedge-shaped characters into clay tablets, capturing a story that feels both familiar and timeless. It is known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. Within this poem, part myth, part reflection on kingship and mortality, we find a striking account of a flood so devastating that it nearly erased humanity. The central figure is not Noah, but Utnapishtim, a man warned by a god to build a massive boat. He fills it with animals, his family and supplies, and when the waters recede, his vessel comes to rest on a mountain. If this sounds like the biblical flood, it should. The Epic of Gilgamesh predates the Hebrew Bible by centuries, and scholars argue it served as a source for later flood traditions. Mainstream historians view the Mesopotamian flood story as an allegory of survival and divine order. In a land defined by the unpredictable flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates, communities depended on irrigation and river cycles. To them, floods were both a blessing and a curse, depositing fertile silt but also wiping out villages without warning. Thus, the story of Utnapishtim may be less about global catastrophe and more about cultural memory of these recurring events, elevated into myth to explain humanity's dependence on and vulnerability to nature's forces. Yet even within mainstream circles there is debate. Could the flood in Gilgamesh reflect a real, extraordinary event that imprinted itself so strongly that it became myth? Archaeologists have discovered flood layers, thick deposits of river silt, in ancient Mesopotamian cities such as Shuruppak and Ur, dating roughly to 2900 BCE. These layers indicate a catastrophic regional flood that destroyed settlements, possibly inspiring the earliest versions of the story. Whether symbolic or literal, the flood in Gilgamesh resonates as both a cautionary tale and a cultural anchor, reminding us how fragile civilization is when confronted with water. Beyond the mainstream explanation lies fertile ground for speculation. Some researchers suggest that the story of Utnapishtim may preserve memories of a much larger catastrophe, not just a Mesopotamian flood, but part of the global event remembered in myths from every continent. They argue that the parallels between Gilgamesh, Noah, and flood heroes in distant cultures, from India's Manu to Deucalion in Greece, suggest a shared origin rather than independent invention. If humanity scattered from a common centre, perhaps carrying oral traditions of survival, then the Gilgamesh tale could represent one of the oldest surviving fragments of this collective memory. Others push the boundaries further. They point to the detailed instructions given to Utnapishtim, measurements for the boat, lists of animals, rituals performed before and after, as evidence that the story is more technical than symbolic. Some alternative theorists claim this points to knowledge handed down by beings more advanced than ordinary humans. Were the gods in Gilgamesh merely deified forces of nature, or could they represent lost cultures or even visitors with knowledge of shipbuilding and survival? While these claims remain speculative, they keep the Gilgamesh flood alive as more than just literature. It becomes a potential window into a forgotten past. The parallels between Gilgamesh and the biblical flood cannot be ignored. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah is similarly commanded by God to build an ark, bring animals, and survive a deluge that destroys nearly all life. Scholars widely agree that the biblical narrative drew directly from Mesopotamian sources, likely carried into Hebrew tradition during the Babylonian exile. Mainstream interpretation sees this as an example of cultural borrowing, a story reworked for new religious purposes. Alternative thinkers, however, suggest another possibility, that both Gilgamesh and Noah derive from an even older source, a primordial account of a real cataclysm. In this view, the similarities are not the result of copying, but of multiple traditions remembering the same event in their own cultural voices. The ark resting on a mountain, for example, recurs across traditions. Utnapishtim lands on Mount Nisya, Noah on Ararat, Deucalion on Parnassus, Manu on the Himalayas. Could this repeated motif suggest survivors across different regions, each remembering the refuge that saved them from the waters? If so, Gilgamesh's flood is not just a Mesopotamian myth, but part of a universal pattern, one whose origins lie deeper than written history. Archaeological discoveries continue to fuel this debate. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated the city of Ur and uncovered a thick layer of silt beneath its ruins. He declared it evidence of the flood. Although later scholars argued it was simply a regional flood deposit, the announcement captured the public imagination. Woolley's claim resonated with those who believed the Gilgamesh story, and by extension the biblical account, was rooted in fact. Since then, flood layers have been found in other Mesopotamian sites, though none prove a single event that could have submerged the world. Mainstream archaeologists caution against conflating regional disasters with global ones. They stress that Mesopotamia's landscape naturally experienced destructive floods, enough to inspire recurring stories without invoking global catastrophe. Yet alternative researchers counter that the persistence of flood stories in nearly every culture suggests more than coincidence. Could it be that the Mesopotamian scribes were not inventing, but recording, a story already thousands of years old when they pressed it into clay? If so, the Epic of Gilgamesh may stand as one of the oldest surviving records of humanity's memory of a shared, ancient trauma. Another layer of intrigue comes from the way gods interact with humans in Gilgamesh's flood story. It is the god Ea who warns Utnapishtim, instructing him to defy the council of gods and save life from destruction. Some alternative researchers suggest that this reflects conflict among beings more advanced than humans, with some wishing to preserve humanity, while others sought its erasure. In this interpretation, the flood was not simply natural disaster, but deliberate cleansing. Mainstream scholars reject this as speculation, interpreting the divine conflict as a metaphor for the unpredictable, often contradictory nature of life and fate. Ancient Mesopotamians lived in a world where the same rivers that nourished them could turn deadly overnight. The gods reflected that duality. But the alternative view lingers. If the gods in these stories were misunderstood beings of flesh and blood, could their quarrels and interventions hint at the presence of others, giants, hybrids, or even alien visitors, living alongside early humans? While evidence is lacking, the enduring fascination with such interpretations shows the power of Gilgamesh not just as literature, but as a springboard into deeper mysteries. In the end, the Epic of Gilgamesh offers more than just a tale of one city's struggle with water. It represents the way human beings confront mortality, catastrophe, and divine power. Mainstream interpretations see it as a cultural artifact, grounded in the landscape of Mesopotamia and the psychology of its people. but the persistence of its flood narrative and its echoes across the world invite us to consider broader possibilities. Was this the story of one flood among many, magnified into myth? Or was it the memory of a singular event carried forward through countless retellings? The tablets of Gilgamesh do not answer this directly, but they preserve the tension between history and myth, science and speculation. In doing so, they form a bridge between the known and the unknown. Whether Utnapishtim was a literary figure or a survivor of a real deluge, his story continues to shape our understanding of humanity's past. And like the floodwaters themselves, the questions it raises flow onward, toward other lands, other myths, and other mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Thus, Gilgamesh's flood is both specific and universal. It is the story of Mesopotamia, of rivers and silt, of gods and men. Yet it is also the story of humanity itself, remembering waters that rose too high and threatened to erase everything. Mainstream scholars emphasize the regional floods. Alternative voices see in it the echo of something much larger. Together they remind us that our oldest written stories are not just tales, they are survival, memory and mystery preserved in clay. The Great Flood is not confined to Mesopotamia or the Mediterranean. Across the world, cultures separated by oceans preserved strikingly similar stories. Water rising, humanity nearly destroyed, and a handful of survivors beginning anew. In India, the ancient Shatapatha Brahmana tells of Manu, a man warned by a divine fish to build a boat. In China, legends of Emperor Yu describe great floods that reshaped the land, with Yu labouring for years to drain waters and carve new rivers. Among the Maya of Mesoamerica, sacred texts like the Popol Vuh recall earlier creations destroyed by water before the present age of humanity emerged. Even in far-off Pacific islands, myths tell of gods unleashing floods to cleanse the earth. Mainstream scholars explain this phenomenon as the power of archetypes. Carl Jung described how human societies, when confronted with universal forces like death, renewal, or catastrophe, create myths with similar themes. Floods are among the most obvious and destructive natural disasters, making them a logical symbol for purification, chaos, and rebirth. Thus, the similarities may reflect independent invention rather than shared memory. Archaeologists also note that many civilizations thrived near rivers or coasts, where floods were common. In such environments, survival depended on respecting water's dual nature, both life-giving and deadly. But the breadth of the myths raises questions. Why do so many accounts feature details beyond generic flooding? Boats, mountain refuges, chosen survivors, and divine warnings recur across cultures that supposedly had no contact. Alternative thinkers argue this points to a real ancient event remembered worldwide. Just as cultures independently invented agriculture or pyramids, perhaps they independently remembered survival from the same catastrophe, one so profound that it became embedded in human consciousness across continents. In India's flood story, the god Vishnu appears as a fish to warn Manu, guiding him to build a vessel and tether it to a mountain until the waters recede. Scholars interpret this as symbolic, aligning with India's monsoon floods and the centrality of rivers like the Ganges. Yet alternative researchers highlight the precision. The boat survives intact, the mountain acts as anchor, and Manu becomes the progenitor of humanity's new cycle. Could this story preserve memory of a specific flood, one so catastrophic that its details survived millennia? Similarly, China's myth of Emperor Yu differs slightly. Rather than surviving a single flood, Yu heroically manages it, redirecting waters with canals and dikes. Mainstream historians see this as a metaphor for statecraft, reflecting the importance of flood control in the Yellow River Basin. But some suggest it hints at massive post-Ice Age floods that required extraordinary collective responses. Yu may not have been a single ruler, but the memory of entire generations battling rising waters, mythologized into a culture hero. These stories show how floods shaped not just survival, but governance, religion, and identity. In the Americas, flood traditions are equally strong. The Aztec Codex Chimalpopoca recounts how an earlier sun, or age of humanity, ended when the world drowned in water, with only a man and woman surviving inside a hollow tree. The Maya Popol Vuh describes failed attempts at creating humanity, with earlier beings washed away by floods before the successful formation of people from maize. Among North American tribes such as the Hopi, stories tell of wickedness bringing a flood, after which survivors emerged into a renewed world. Mainstream anthropology views these as moral tales, emphasizing human renewal and the cycle of destruction and rebirth. But alternative perspectives note the similarities to Old World accounts: divine punishment, chosen survivors, and rebirth from catastrophe. Some argue that these parallels suggest cultural contact, though evidence for transoceanic exchange at such early dates is contested. Others believe the stories reflect a shared global trauma, preserved independently across isolated peoples. Whether symbolic or historical, the flood is central to explaining the fragility and resilience of humanity in the face of overwhelming forces. The Pacific Islands add yet another layer to the story. Polynesian myths tell of gods unleashing floods to punish disobedience, with survivors clinging to canoes or mountain peaks. In Hawaii, a legend speaks of Nu, who built a large canoe to survive a flood, later offering sacrifice on a mountaintop, a detail remarkably similar to Noah's Ark narrative. In New Zealand, Maori traditions recount a great inundation sent by angry deities, reshaping valleys and coasts. Mainstream interpretations see these stories as reflections of life on islands vulnerable to storms, tsunamis, and volcanic activity. Communities in such landscapes inevitably face disasters that shape their oral traditions. Yet the recurring themes of divine warnings and chosen survivors again blur the line between independent myth and shared memory. Some researchers suggest that the Pacific myths may preserve echoes of rapid sea level rise that submerged vast island chains after the Ice Age. Others extend this idea to claim that advanced seafaring cultures once navigated the Pacific before being lost to floods, their memory surviving only in myth. While speculative, the resonance of these stories across vast ocean distances keeps the mystery alive. One of the great puzzles of comparative mythology is whether such global similarities reflect diffusion or coincidence. Mainstream scholars lean toward coincidence, shaped by similar human environments and psychology. Floods are universal experiences, so it is no surprise they inspire universal myths. Archaeologists find little hard evidence linking distant flood traditions, and most prefer to treat each as an independent creation. Alternative researchers, however, argue for diffusion or shared origin. They point to linguistic parallels, such as the repeated motif of mountains as refuges, or names for flood heroes that share phonetic similarities across cultures. While these connections are debated and often speculative, they highlight how oral traditions might preserve fragments of very ancient encounters or migrations. If a single global event did occur, its memory could have spread as survivors scattered, carrying stories that evolved into the myths we know today. Whether or not this is true, the consistency of detail across continents challenges us to consider that myths may be more than imagination. They may be coded history. The global flood myths therefore offer two paths of interpretation. On one side lies the mainstream view, myths as archetypes, born from humanity's universal struggle with water. On the other side lies speculation, that myths preserve memory of a single catastrophic event, perhaps at the end of the Ice Age, that shaped humanity's destiny. Both explanations may hold truth. Myths often weave together lived experience and symbolic meaning, blurring the line between memory and metaphor. What makes these stories so compelling is their persistence. For thousands of years, across continents, through the rise and fall of civilizations, they have been told and retold. Whether instructing moral lessons, encoding practical survival knowledge, or recalling real disasters, they endure as humanity's way of remembering. And yet, beneath their poetry, a question lingers. Do they point to something more? A chapter of history lost beneath waves, erased but not forgotten. Flood myths across India, China, the Americas, and the Pacific show remarkable unity despite vast distances. Mainstream explanations stress archetypes and local floods. Alternatives suggest shared memory of a global catastrophe. Both views highlight the flood as humanity's most enduring story, one that explains not just destruction, but survival, rebirth, and mystery. From river valleys to mountaintops, from manuscripts to oral chants, the flood endures because it speaks to something deep within us, the fear of loss and the hope of renewal. When the last ice age ended, rising seas did not simply redraw coastlines, they drowned entire landscapes. Today, more than 20% of humanity lives within 30 kilometers of a coast, but in prehistory, that percentage was far higher. Rivers, estuaries and shores provided food, trade routes and fertile soil. When the waters rose, they erased the very places where early human communities thrived. Evidence of these submerged worlds remains hidden beneath oceans, waiting to be uncovered. Around the world, hints of ancient structures, sometimes natural, sometimes human-made, have sparked debates about whether lost civilizations lie beneath the waves. One of the most famous examples is off the coast of India, near the modern city of Dwarka. Here, sonar surveys and dives have revealed stone structures, walls, and pillars stretching along the seabed. Archaeologists link them to ancient Dwarka, a city described in Hindu scriptures as the legendary home of Krishna. Mainstream scholars argue that these remains represent later historic settlements submerged by rising seas and earthquakes. Radiocarbon dating of artifacts suggests occupation within the last few thousand years, not the deep antiquity of myth. Alternative thinkers, however, argue the site may be far older. They point to unusual construction patterns and stone alignments that seem out of place for known historic eras. Some suggest that Dwarka was one of many coastal cities swallowed at the end of the Ice Age, preserving memory in the stories of Krishna's drowned kingdom. If so, this would push back Indian urban history by millennia, rewriting what we know about early civilization. While evidence remains debated, Dwarka illustrates how myth and archaeology often converge in the shifting boundary between land and sea. Across the waters in Japan lies Yonaguni, another controversial site. In the 1980s, divers discovered massive stone terraces, steps, and what appeared to be platforms on the seabed near the Ryukyu Islands. Some formations resemble staircases, pyramids, and plazas. To the casual eye, they look unmistakably artificial. Yet most geologists maintain that Yonaguni's formations are natural, the result of tectonic activity and erosion, shaping sandstone into geometric patterns. Mainstream science stresses that without clear evidence of tool marks, artifacts, or cultural layers, Yonaguni cannot be considered a true archaeological site. Still, alternative researchers see Yonaguni as proof of a sunken civilization, perhaps contemporary with the fabled Atlantis. They highlight features like symmetrical walls, aligned pillars, and what they interpret as carvings resembling animals and symbols. If human hands shaped Yonaguni, then it would represent a civilization existing thousands of years earlier than mainstream history allows. Whether natural or human-made, Yonaguni keeps the debate alive and fuels the question of how much of humanity's story rests beneath the waves. The Mediterranean, too, holds its share of mysteries. Off the coast of Malta, divers have reported large stone blocks and structures resembling temples, eerily similar to the megalithic complexes on land. The Mediterranean basin, once a hub of early trade and settlement, experienced dramatic sea level changes, and many low-lying areas would have been inundated. Archaeological evidence confirms submerged settlements in places like Israel's Atlit Yam, a Neolithic village preserved underwater complete with houses, hearths, and even a stone circle. Mainstream interpretations accept sites like Atlit Yam as genuine examples of early human habitation, drowned by rising seas. But the more ambiguous structures, those without clear cultural context, invite speculation. Could the Mediterranean seabed conceal older, unknown civilizations, wiped out by floods before history began? Advocates of this idea point to similarities between submerged and terrestrial megalithic architecture, suggesting continuity with cultures that predate written records. Critics caution that erosion can mimic human construction, and until solid evidence emerges, the idea of lost Mediterranean civilizations remains unproven. Yet the possibility continues to inspire, reminding us how much of our past may lie just beyond reach. In the Caribbean and the Americas, stories of sunken lands also persist. Near Cuba, sonar scans in 2001 reportedly revealed massive stone structures at depths of 600 meters. Some reports describe pyramids and roads, leading to sensational claims of a lost city. Mainstream scientists remain cautious, noting the lack of peer-reviewed studies and the difficulty of conducting deep-sea verification. Similar claims have arisen around the Bimini Road in the Bahamas, where underwater rock formations resemble a paved pathway. Geologists explain them as natural beach rock fractured into rectangular patterns, yet believers see them as remnants of Atlantis or another advanced culture. Alternative interpretations flourish here. Some suggest these sites represent seafaring societies wiped out during sudden sea level rise, their memory echoing in Plato's story of Atlantis. Others argue that the Caribbean myths of drowned islands may reflect genuine prehistoric events, remembered in oral tradition. While hard evidence remains elusive, the allure of lost civilizations beneath the tropical seas continues to draw explorers and theorists alike. Whether natural formation or cultural remains, these sites highlight humanity's deep desire to connect myth with material proof. Mainstream archaeology emphasizes caution. Most underwater discoveries to date belong to known historical periods, their submergence explained by gradual sea level rise, tectonic shifts, or local disasters. Proven sites like Atlit Yam demonstrate the vulnerability of early settlements, but they do not prove the existence of advanced unknown civilizations. Still, the sheer scale of unexplored ocean, more than 70% of Earth's surface, means vast evidence may remain undiscovered. Each sonar survey or accidental find fuels speculation about what lies hidden. Alternative thinkers argue that this very gap in exploration creates room for suppression or oversight. They claim that academic reluctance to investigate ambiguous sites stems from fear of rewriting history. If structures like Yonaguni or Cuba's underwater formations were accepted as human-made, they would force a radical rethinking of civilization's timeline. This tension between skepticism and curiosity defines the debate on submerged worlds. The question is not only whether ruins exist, but what they would mean. Evidence of forgotten human cultures, or proof that myths of global floods and lost lands preserve memories of real events far older than textbooks allow. The stories of Dwarka, Yonaguni, and Atlit Yam all converge on a single truth. When the seas rose, humanity lost more than land. We lost memory. For coastal peoples, survival meant migration, leaving behind homes, temples, and stories swallowed by the ocean. Myths of drowned kingdoms and God-sent floods may not be inventions at all, but echoes of these real displacements. Mainstream scholars ground these stories in environmental history, while alternative voices push them into the realm of lost civilizations and advanced knowledge. Both views recognize the same reality. Beneath the waves lies a chapter of our story we have barely begun to read. The ocean floor remains one of the last great frontiers of archaeology. With modern technology, we may yet uncover settlements that prove ordinary explanations correct, or discoveries that challenge everything we thought we knew. Until then, the mysteries of submerged civilizations remind us that the line between myth and history is often drawn in water. Submerged ruins ignite imagination because they blur fact and legend. Mainstream archaeology sees them as drowned villages of known peoples. Alternative theorists see lost worlds erased by the flood. Both agree that rising seas reshaped human destiny. What waits on the seafloor may confirm the ordinary, or reveal the extraordinary. Among the most intriguing elements of flood myths and ancient traditions are the figures of others, beings not quite like us, sometimes described as giants, sometimes as hybrids of humans and animals, and sometimes as divine or semi-divine rulers. From the Nephilim in the Hebrew Bible to the Titans of Greek mythology, from Native American traditions of enormous warriors to Sumerian depictions of half-human, half-animal beings, the ancient world seemed to remember companions, or adversaries, who were not ordinary humans. The question is whether these stories represent symbolic archetypes, exaggerations of memory, or distorted recollections of something real. Mainstream historians explain these accounts as metaphors. Giants symbolize power, chaos, or forces of nature, while hybrids often reflect cultural beliefs about animals and gods. For example, Mesopotamian art shows figures with wings, lion heads, or fishtails, not as literal beings, but as symbolic representations of divine qualities. Similarly, the Nephilim of Genesis are often interpreted as exaggerated accounts of mighty rulers or warriors, not an actual race of giant people. In anthropology, the human tendency to mythologize and exaggerate explains why so many cultures independently produce stories of beings larger, stronger, or stranger than ordinary humans. Archaeological evidence supports this cautious approach. Skeletal remains alleged to be giants have often been shown to be misidentified prehistoric animals, or in some cases outright hoaxes. Natural variation in human height, combined with mythic storytelling, provides a reasonable explanation for most giant traditions. Yet despite these mainstream views, the persistence of such stories across continents continues to spark curiosity. If they are purely symbolic, why are the details so consistent? Why do so many myths describe floods that wiped out not just humans, but also these others? Alternative researchers propose that myths of giants and hybrids may preserve memories of real beings. Some suggest that ancient humans encountered other hominid species, such as Neanderthals or Denisovans, and remembered them in exaggerated form. Others go further, arguing that genetic mixing between early humans and other species produced hybrids, perhaps inspiring myths of beings who are stronger, taller, or more resilient. Genetic studies have indeed confirmed interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, leaving traces in our DNA today. Could oral tradition have magnified this memory into stories of giants and demigods? More speculative theories suggest that some skeletal finds dismissed by mainstream science may represent evidence of unusually large individuals or even a distinct population. Reports of oversized bones unearthed in the 19th and early 20th centuries, though rarely verified, continue to fuel belief in hidden evidence of giants. Critics argue that many such claims were fabrications, but the stories persist, often tied to flood myths in which these beings perished. If nothing else, the consistency of such narratives hints at a deeper origin, perhaps cultural memory distorted by time or encounters with beings long vanished from the earth. Hybrid beings also populate ancient traditions. In Sumerian myth, Apkallu were half-human sages sent by the gods to bring civilizations gifts, knowledge of agriculture, writing, and building. Egyptian art depicts gods with animal heads, blending human and animal traits. Greek mythology introduces centaurs, satyrs, and minotaurs, beings caught between categories. Mainstream scholarship interprets these hybrids symbolically as expressions of human-animal relationships, natural forces, or moral lessons. But alternative thinkers suggest they might point to attempts at early genetic manipulation, or memories of beings that were literally different. Some even argue that flood myths record the destruction of these hybrids, swept away when the gods, or nature, purged the world. In the Book of Enoch, the flood is sent to cleanse the earth of the Nephilim, offspring of divine beings and human women. To alternative researchers, this story reads less like metaphor and more like history, a record of beings erased by catastrophe. While mainstream academia rejects such readings, the persistence of hybrids across global mythologies invites us to question whether these are purely inventions or symbolic recollections of beings humanity once believed walked beside us. Archaeological puzzles sometimes add fuel to these interpretations. Large megalithic structures, from Stonehenge to the pyramids, have prompted speculation about whether ordinary humans of their time could have built them unaided. Mainstream archaeology attributes these achievements to ingenuity, coordinated labour, and centuries of refinement. But some alternative voices argue that myths of giants and semi-divine beings may reflect the memory of those who actually contributed to such feats. Could legends of giant builders or hybrid sages preserve distorted memories of real people or cultures, later mythologized as more than human? Similarly, some anomalous artifacts, oversized weapons, massive skeletal remains, or depictions of outsized rulers are cited as potential evidence. Mainstream explanations identify these as ritual objects, symbolic art, or exaggerations of human scale. Still, for those inclined to see myth as memory, they remain tantalizing hints. If such beings did exist, their disappearance during floods could explain why they are remembered mainly in stories, not in surviving populations. Whether literal or symbolic, the myths suggest humanity once believed it shared the earth with others, larger, stranger, and perhaps wiser. Mainstream science emphasizes caution above all. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and so far no verified remains of a separate race of giants or hybrids have been found. Fossil records confirm the existence of other hominids, but not of mythic beings as described in sacred texts. The persistence of these myths is explained through psychology, culture, and the human tendency to weave meaning into the natural world. To many scholars, the Nephilim, Titans, and Apkallu are powerful symbols, not physical beings, yet the mystery endures. Alternative researchers continue to collect oral traditions, anomalous reports, and ambiguous finds, building a case that mainstream science has overlooked or suppressed evidence. While this position lacks solid proof, it taps into a universal sense of curiosity. Could our ancestors have encountered beings unlike us, whether taller, stronger, or more animal-like, and preserve those encounters in story form? The flood myths, which often describe not only humanity's near destruction but also the eradication of these others, keep the question alive. If nothing else, they remind us that humanity's story has always included the sense that we were not alone, The theme of giants and hybrids adds depth to the mystery of the Great Flood. Mainstream scholars see metaphor, while alternative thinkers glimpse memory. Either way, the presence of others in ancient stories reflects a fundamental human question. What makes us human, and who else might have shared our world? The flood may symbolize not just survival from nature's fury, but also the loss of those who were different. Whether they were myth, memory, or metaphor, the others add a layer of complexity to humanity's most enduring story. As we move forward, the debate continues. Giants, hybrids, and divine beings may never be proven to exist in the literal sense, but their place in human culture is undeniable. They shape our myths, inspire our imaginations, and raise questions about our origins. In the story of the flood, they remind us that survival often means loss, not just of land and life, but of companions, real or imagined, who once filled the world of our ancestors. Giants and hybrids remain one of history's most provocative mysteries. Mainstream explanations frame them as symbols. Alternative views see them as echoes of lost beings erased in cataclysm. Both interpretations highlight humanity's fascination with the idea that we were not alone. Whether myth or memory, the flood marks their end and our beginning. Among the most controversial ideas tied to flood myths and lost civilizations is the notion that humanity once encountered beings from the stars, an idea known today as the ancient astronaut hypothesis. Popularized in the 20th century by authors like Erich von Däniken, the theory suggests that myths of gods, sky beings, and advanced knowledge are not metaphors but memories of contact with extraterrestrials. Proponents argue that when ancient people described beings descending from the heavens, they were recording encounters with advanced visitors, misunderstood as divine. Mainstream scholars dismiss this interpretation as pseudoscience. They argue that ancient myths reflect human imagination, culture, and environment, not contact with aliens. For archaeologists, the achievements of Egypt, Sumer, or the Maya are the product of human ingenuity and centuries of trial and error. Yet despite criticism, the idea of ancient contact continues to fascinate. Perhaps this is because the stories themselves, of gods warning of floods, teaching agriculture, or granting laws, invite speculation about whether humanity once received knowledge from beyond. Mesopotamian myths are often cited by proponents of ancient astronauts. In Sumerian tradition, the Anunnaki were described as powerful deities who descended from the heavens to shape human destiny. Mainstream scholars interpret the Anunnaki as ordinary gods in a polytheistic pantheon, embodying natural forces and royal authority. Yet alternative theorists argue that the Anunnaki were not merely symbols, but visitors who shared advanced knowledge, possibly even altering humanity itself. The flood story of Gilgamesh features divine beings debating humanity's fate, one warning Utnapishtim to build a boat, others demanding destruction. Some interpret this as evidence of conflict among extraterrestrial factions, deciding whether humanity should survive. While archaeology sees no reason to believe these were anything other than myths, the details of construction, measurements, and divine intervention continue to feed speculation. Were these gods metaphors for rivers and storms, or memories of beings whose power seemed otherworldly? The Anunnaki remain a focal point for debates about how far myth can stretch before it becomes history in disguise. Egypt also features prominently in this debate. The Great Pyramids, the Sphinx, and temple inscriptions inspire questions about whether such achievements could have been accomplished without outside help. Mainstream Egyptology explains these monuments as the result of decades of labor, coordinated administration, and remarkable engineering skill. The precision of the pyramids, aligned with cardinal directions, is attributed to careful observation of the stars by priests and surveyors. Alternative interpretations see the same evidence differently. They argue that Egypt's sudden rise to monumental architecture reflects lost knowledge, perhaps inherited from earlier civilizations, or given by sky beings. Depictions of gods like Ra or Osiris arriving from the heavens, and myths of Zep Tepi, the first time, are read by some as literal accounts of contact. For believers, the pyramids are not just tombs, but markers of a time when humanity interacted with advanced visitors. Mainstream archaeology resists these claims, but the allure of Egypt as a link between earth and sky ensures that speculation endures. Across the ocean in the Andes, Peru's Nazca Lines also fuel the ancient astronaut hypothesis. These massive geoglyphs, etched into the desert floor, form animals, geometric shapes, and straight lines stretching for kilometers. From the ground, they are barely recognizable, but from above they reveal deliberate design. Mainstream explanations argue that they were ritual pathways and offerings to sky gods, visible from nearby hills, or perhaps imagined as seen by divine beings above. Alternative thinkers see the Nazca Lines as airstrips, or signals to extraterrestrials, evidence that the Nazca people were communicating with beings from the sky. Critics argue this underestimates the ingenuity and spirituality of ancient cultures, imposing modern ideas of technology on sacred symbols. Yet the fact remains that the Nazca created works best appreciated from the air, an intriguing detail that keeps speculation alive. Whether made for gods, ancestors, or imagined sky beings, the Nazca Lines remind us that humans have always looked upward, weaving the heavens into the fabric of their stories. Mesoamerican traditions further expand this theme. In Maya and Aztec mythology, gods often descend from the sky, bringing knowledge or demanding sacrifice. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, is said to have taught agriculture, astronomy, and governance before departing with a promise to return. Mainstream historians interpret Quetzalcoatl as a cultural symbol, embodying rulership, fertility, and celestial cycles. But some researchers suggest the myths may describe a being who was real, remembered as a sky visitor. Mainstream archaeology firmly rejects the idea of extraterrestrial contact, noting that no physical evidence supports such claims. Civilizations like Egypt, Sumer, and the Maya are well explained by human innovation, social organization, and cultural exchange. Suggesting aliens, critics argue, undermines the achievements of ancient people. Instead, mainstream scholarship emphasizes how myths reflect cultural values and the human tendency to project divinity onto the unknown. Still, the ancient astronaut hypothesis persists. This endurance may say less about aliens and more about ourselves. The idea that knowledge was given, not earned, appeals to our sense of wonder. It also provides a dramatic explanation for why myths across cultures describe gods who arrive, warn of floods, or teach skills. While extraordinary evidence is lacking, the stories themselves remain compelling, leaving space for speculation. The flood myths, when read through this lens, become not only accounts of nature's fury, but also of cosmic encounters. Did beings from the sky decide who survived? Mainstream science says no, but the question refuses to fade. The ancient astronaut hypothesis thus stands at the edge of myth and speculation. For mainstream scholars, it remains outside history, an imaginative projection onto sacred stories. For alternative thinkers, it is the missing piece that explains the uncanny similarities of myths worldwide. The flood becomes not only geological but cosmic, not only survival of humans, but also the departure of gods or visitors. Ultimately, the hypothesis reflects humanity's oldest impulse, to look upward and ask who else is out there. Whether we call them gods, angels, or extraterrestrials, the beings of myth may be mirrors of our imagination, or, as some hope, records of encounters long forgotten. Without physical proof, the idea remains speculative. Yet its persistence in popular culture and scholarship alike shows how deeply it resonates. The flood myths may be metaphors, but they may also be invitations to keep searching, questioning, and wondering about what our ancestors truly saw when they looked at the sky. The ancient astronaut hypothesis divides opinion sharply. Mainstream archaeology sees myth, culture, and ingenuity. Alternative thinkers see memory of encounters with sky beings. Both agree that the flood myths link heaven and earth, gods and humans, survival and renewal. Whether aliens ever walked among us may never be known, but the question endures, because the stories endure. For every mystery that surrounds the Great Flood, submerged ruins, or the myths of giants and sky beings, mainstream archaeology offers a grounded explanation. Scholars stress that human ingenuity, adaptation, and cultural storytelling can account for what alternative theorists interpret as lost civilizations or extraterrestrial contact. Archaeology relies on context, stratigraphy, dating methods, and cultural layers that allow researchers to build a coherent timeline. From this perspective, extraordinary claims must meet the same rigorous standards of evidence as any other discovery. Without verifiable artifacts, peer-reviewed analysis, or repeatable results, speculative interpretations remain outside the boundaries of science. Mainstream scholars also note the danger of undermining ancient peoples' achievements, suggesting that pyramids, megaliths, or Nazca Lines required outside help denies the capacity of human societies. Through cooperation, innovation, and time, humans transformed their environments and built wonders that still inspire awe. In this view, myths are not literal records but windows into cultural psychology, shaping identity and memory without needing to describe real extraterrestrial or lost beings. One of the strongest tools archaeology brings to the flood debate is geology. Geological records clearly demonstrate that sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age. Meltwater pulses, shifting rivers, and regional catastrophes explain how early communities experienced floods severe enough to inspire lasting stories. Stratified deposits of silt in Mesopotamia, submerged Neolithic villages like at Lit Yam in Israel, and drowned landscapes such as Doggerland in the North Sea all provide evidence of real local disasters. Mainstream scholars argue that these events are sufficient to explain the persistence of flood myths worldwide. From this perspective, myths function as cultural memory of natural events, rather than evidence of supernatural or extraterrestrial intervention. The alignment between geological events and mythic traditions strengthens the case that human imagination transforms trauma into story. The floods were real, but they were natural. While alternative theorists seek evidence of global catastrophes or hidden civilizations, mainstream geology sees no need to look beyond climate change and tectonic activity. The Earth itself is dramatic enough to explain the legends. Archaeology also highlights human adaptability. Where alternative narratives imagine sudden lost civilizations, mainstream interpretations point to migration and resilience. Communities displaced by rising seas carried their traditions inland, preserving them in oral form. These stories evolved into myths of divine punishment or salvation. Rather than evidence of erased advanced cultures, they are proof of humanity's ability to endure change. Consider the example of Sunderland in Southeast Asia. As sea levels rose, its fertile lowlands drowned, scattering populations to the islands that form modern Indonesia and the Philippines. Mainstream research links this dispersal to the spread of Austronesian languages and cultures. Myths of lost lands survive in island traditions, but archaeology interprets them as memories of migration, not Atlantis. The story is not one of vanished civilizations, but of continuity, adaptation, and survival. For mainstream scholars, this narrative honors the creativity of ancient peoples, without needing to invoke suppressed knowledge or alien intervention. When it comes to giants and hybrids, mainstream science emphasizes anthropology and biology. While oral traditions describe beings of enormous size, no verified skeletal remains have been found that would suggest a separate race of giants. Reports of oversized bones often trace back to misidentified fossils of Ice Age animals such as mammoths or mastodons. In other cases, exaggerated stories circulated in the 19th century, fueled by newspaper hoaxes and public fascination with the bizarre. Genetics confirms that humans interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, but these were not giants. They were close relatives whose legacy survives in our DNA. Hybrid beings in art are likewise understood as symbolic. Mesopotamian winged figures, Egyptian animal-headed gods, and Greek mythic creatures reflect religious belief and cultural imagination, not laboratory experiments. To mainstream scholars, interpreting these images literally overlooks their role as metaphors for natural forces, divine authority, or human-animal relationships. The persistence of such symbols across cultures speaks to universal themes, not hidden biology. Flood myths that describe the destruction of hybrids, like the Nephilim, are interpreted as moral allegories, stories about human hubris and divine justice, not records of real species erased by catastrophe. The same critical lens applies to claims of ancient astronauts. Mainstream archaeology argues that human achievements, from pyramids to irrigation systems, are well explained by ingenuity, labour, and accumulated knowledge. Alignments with stars reflect careful observation, not alien instruction. The Nazca Lines are seen as ritual pathways and offerings to gods, not runways for spacecraft. Civilizations across the world developed astronomy, mathematics, and architecture independently, shaped by their unique environments and cultural needs. Critics of the ancient astronaut hypothesis also highlight its cultural consequences. By attributing human accomplishments to extraterrestrials, the theory diminishes the agency of ancient peoples. It frames them as passive recipients of knowledge rather than innovators. This perspective, scholars argue, risks perpetuating stereotypes that ancient societies were incapable of great feats without outside help. By contrast, Archaeology celebrates these societies for their achievements, ingenuity, and resilience. While myths of gods descending from the sky remain captivating, they are understood as reflections of human imagination, not encounters with visitors from beyond. Mainstream archaeology does not deny mystery. It embraces it through science. Each excavation uncovers new questions, each discovery refines our timeline, but it demands caution, patience, and evidence. The flood myths are understood as cultural responses to real geological events. Submerged ruins are interpreted as drowned settlements of known peoples. Giants and hybrids are seen as metaphors or misinterpretations, and claims of ancient astronauts remain in the realm of speculation, not science. Alternative theories persist because they speak to human wonder, and archaeology acknowledges that curiosity has value. But until extraordinary evidence is produced, the mainstream view remains firm. The story of humanity is extraordinary enough without invoking lost civilizations or alien visitors. The flood reminds us of our vulnerability to nature, but also our resilience. Our ancestors were not passive recipients of knowledge, they were creators, survivors, and innovators whose legacy continues to shape our world. Flood stories are unique among myths in that they straddle the line between allegory and possible memory. Unlike tales of dragons or shapeshifters, floods are events that communities really experienced, sometimes catastrophically. The geological record confirms rising seas, sudden floods, and displaced populations at the end of the Ice Age. For mainstream scholars, this explains the presence of flood stories in nearly every culture. They are cultural memory of survival, passed down in oral tradition. Yet myth is never a perfect mirror of reality. Over centuries, real events become reshaped into narratives of divine punishment, chosen survivors, and cosmic renewal. The blurred line lies here. Myths both preserve and transform. They may encode real memories, but through the filters of imagination, symbolism, and religious meaning. For archaeologists, this makes myths invaluable, but unreliable. They point to real events, but cannot be read as literal history. Still, the remarkable similarity of details across continents challenges us to consider whether oral tradition may carry more truth than we often allow. Oral tradition has proven resilient in ways once underestimated. Anthropologists have documented indigenous Australian stories describing coastal landscapes that disappeared beneath the sea more than 7,000 years ago, accounts now confirmed by geological studies. In North America, some native stories recall glaciers and megafauna from the Ice Age, showing that oral memory can endure for millennia. These examples strengthen the idea that myths may indeed preserve fragments of real history. Mainstream scholars argue, however, that while memory can be long, it is also malleable. Myths are retold in each generation, shaped by cultural needs. They are as much about explaining the present as remembering the past. This means that while details may reflect real events, the narratives around them shift. Flood myths may begin as recollections of rising seas, but evolve into lessons about morality, obedience to gods, or cycles of destruction and renewal. In this view, myths are true and untrue at the same time. They are faithful to the experience of catastrophe, but fictional in their framing. Alternative researchers seize on these examples of deep-time oral memory to argue that myths may contain far more historical truth than mainstream academia admits. They suggest that stories of global floods, giants, or sky beings are not just archetypes, but encoded records of events long forgotten. For them, myths are a kind of archive, distorted but still legible if one knows how to read them. The flood, then, becomes not metaphor but memory, a memory of real cataclysm preserved across continents, yet the challenge remains, distinguishing memory from metaphor. A story that describes giants might be an exaggerated account of encountering another hominid species, or simply a symbolic way of expressing power. A tale of gods descending from the sky could represent a natural disaster, a solar event, or, as some argue, a literal encounter with beings beyond our world. The line is blurred, and in that blur speculation thrives. Whether these stories hold coded truths or not, their consistency across cultures remains striking. The flood myths also illustrate how cultural values shape memory. In Mesopotamia, the flood is framed as punishment for human noise and disobedience. In the Hebrew Bible, it becomes a story of righteousness rewarded and corruption destroyed. In the Americas, Floods often symbolize cycles of destruction and rebirth, part of a larger cosmic rhythm. These variations show how each culture molded memory into a lesson that fit its worldview. Mainstream scholars argue this is evidence that myth is primarily symbolic, not historical. But alternative thinkers note that beneath the variations the same structure persists: a great flood, survivors on a boat or mountain, and a rebirth of humanity. They suggest this consistency points to a shared origin, with each culture adapting the same core memory to its own values. The flood is thus both history and allegory, fact remembered through the lens of meaning. This dual nature is what makes the myth so enduring and so mysterious. Modern neuroscience offers another perspective. Memory, it tells us, is not static but reconstructive. Each time a story is told, it is rebuilt, mixing fragments of past and present. This explains why myths preserve some consistent elements, but also accumulate symbolic layers. From a mainstream perspective, this supports the idea that myths are cultural memory filtered through imagination. Yet for alternative thinkers, even imperfect memory can carry kernels of truth. Just as a dream may distort real experience, a myth may exaggerate but still recall genuine events. The flood myths may therefore be read as dreams of humanity, exaggerated, symbolic and moralized, but rooted in real trauma. Rising seas, storms and displacements left scars too deep to vanish, so they became stories. Whether those stories recall only natural disasters or also encounters with other beings or lost civilizations remains debated. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Myths are not literal history, but neither are they pure invention. They are memories refracted through time. The blurred lines between myth and memory keep the flood at the heart of human imagination. For mainstream archaeology, the stories confirm humanity's resilience and creativity in making sense of catastrophe. For alternative voices, they whisper of forgotten chapters, global cataclysms, lost peoples, even visitors from beyond. Both views recognize that myth and memory are intertwined, inseparable. This duality explains why the flood endures. It is history and allegory, trauma and teaching, memory and myth. When we listen to these stories, we're hearing echoes of real human experiences shaped into timeless lessons. They remind us that the past is not only written in stone but carried in words, chants, and tales that survived against all odds. The line may be blurred, but it is within that blur that mystery thrives, and where the search for truth continues. The story of the Great Flood has carried us from clay tablets in Mesopotamia to oral traditions in the Pacific, from submerged ruins in the Mediterranean to speculation about giants and sky beings. At every step, mainstream archaeology has offered natural explanations: rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, regional floods recorded in sediments, migration patterns preserved in oral tradition. These views emphasize human resilience, the capacity of our ancestors to survive catastrophe, adapt, and rebuild. For science, this is extraordinary enough, that humanity endured global upheaval and left behind stories to remember it. But the flood also transcends science. Myths are not merely records of geology. They are humanity's oldest reflections on meaning, justice, and survival. They remind us that history is not only stone and soil, but also story. Whether allegory or memory, the flood endures because it speaks to the deepest human fears and hopes, that destruction can also be renewal, that loss can be followed by rebirth. Alternative voices insist there is more beneath the waves. They argue that submerged ruins like Dwarka or Yonaguni hint at civilizations erased from memory. They suggest that stories of giants and hybrids may preserve echoes of other species, or that myths of sky beings may point to encounters beyond Earth. Mainstream scholars remain cautious, demanding physical evidence that has yet to surface. But the persistence of these ideas reveals something important. Myths endure not only because they explain the past, but because they keep alive the possibility that history is incomplete. The ocean floor, still largely unexplored, holds countless secrets. Every sonar survey and underwater excavation could confirm mainstream science, or uncover something unexpected. Until then, speculation fills the gaps. For believers, the flood hides evidence of forgotten chapters. For skeptics, it reveals only the creativity of human imagination. Between these poles lies the mystery itself, and it is this mystery that continues to draw explorers, storytellers, and seekers. In the end, the Great Flood remains what it has always been: a crossroads. On one side is the firm ground of science, explaining floods through geology and memory. On the other side is the wide ocean of speculation, where myths hint at giants, gods, and civilizations lost. Perhaps the truth is a mixture of both. Memory preserved but reshaped, history recorded but transformed. What is certain is that the flood cannot be dismissed. It is one of humanity's oldest, most persistent stories, linking us across continents and centuries. The waters may have risen and receded, but the questions remain. What did our ancestors truly witness when they told of floods that ended worlds? Were they describing nature's fury alone, or remembering encounters with others now lost? Science offers one answer, myth another. Between them lies a space of wonder. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the flood, that even as oceans conceal ruins and stories conceal truth, we are left with the same enduring task, to keep searching for what they hide beneath the waves,